Hey everybody, Bedbug Guy is back. I know it's been a while, but pest control gets really busy here at this time of year in the FLA. But I had some time and I watched the Zahi Hawass interview on the Joe Rogan Experience and thought I'd make a video to give my thoughts and hopefully clear up some of the confusion that happened. Now, originally when I heard this was going to happen, I was slightly happy because finally Joe Rogan was going to have an actual Egyptology expert on to answer some of these questions that he has. And of course, it's Zahi Hawass, so I already had my expectations. He gets a lot of people on, alternative historians, scientists, but he's never really had an actual mainstream Egyptologist on to discuss these things. He's never going to talk to me. He only talks to the known and blown, and I'm neither, but I have to rely on those people to hopefully, answer some of his questions. Now, if you watched it, you learned, and if you haven't, you should know that talking to Dr. Hawass is an absolute chore. And if you ask him questions, he may or may not answer them. Or he'll answer a question you didn't ask, or he'll answer the question that he thinks you should have asked. That's just the way he is. Sometimes he doesn't understand the question, which was evident in the video and in the podcast. I don't think that's a language barrier, from what I understand from people who've worked with him and know him, that it doesn't get any better if you're speaking Arabic to him. But there were some good parts of it and some parts that I, really want to talk to people and clear up, and since nobody around here wants to talk about it, I put it all out to the general world. So starts off, Zahi comes on, he's sucking on that big cigar, and he's pimping his book and his lecture tour, which is understandable. And then he says they're going to talk about two things. They're going to talk about the pyramids and the Sphinx. So they start off with the pyramids, and it starts off pretty good, explaining the stonework in the Great Pyramid and the pyramid construction and all the archaeological evidence with the workers in the city and the writing and things like that. So Joe asks a couple questions about cutting stone. Well, Dr. Hawass talks about the tools that they found, and the pictures are, of course, in his book that he wants everybody to buy, but they search online and eventually they find these diorite tools and things like that. And Joe makes the mistake of asking the question, how did they move these giant granite blocks? And Dr. Hawass says they used their brain, and then he tells a story. And it's about tomb workers. I don't mean tomb workers. Modern Egyptian workers that work on excavations. They're working in this tomb. He had a 50-ton sarcophagus. They had to get the 20-ton lid off of it. He said it only took 4 guys a couple of minutes, and they were able to get the lid off and move it. Then there was another second. They had to do this over and over again. And they did it by using a mechanical advantage. He called it something like a devil. And they couldn't find a picture of it. I've seen it. If you watch a bunch of boring documentaries about Egyptology and excavations, you can see this in action. They use some sort of mechanical advantage that lifts things up, and they wedge wood, and they're able to move it. So the point of that exercise was that the ancient Egyptians, knew about mechanical advantages, and they used their head. But he stops there because Joe says, well, how did they get him up the pyramid? And Zahi just never answers the question, which is odd for a guy who says over and over again that he knows every grain of sand on that Giza Plateau for the last 57 years. That's just him. So let me give you a couple possibilities and the absolute truth. One possibility he could have mentioned is, hey, there's 10,000 guys. 1,000 guys could yank that sucker up the pyramid, no problem. Number one. Number two, he cited Houdin's work about mechanical advantages being built into the pyramid. There's proof of that. It's out there. It's in another one of my videos. I'm not going to go into it. Whether he subscribes to that or not, who knows? But he could have just told the absolute truth, and that is that nobody is exactly sure. Okay? And just let it go with that. And then Joe asks about transporting the large granite blocks from Aswan in the south up the Nile to the Giza Plateau. And then he makes a comment about getting the stones up and down a mountain. If anybody can get through to Joe Rogan, let him know he's confused. The stone granite up and down the mountains, that's actually in Peru, not Egypt. The quarries are right on the river in Egypt. So Zahi says, oh yeah, they just take it up, boom. And Joe's like, what, in a raft? Yeah, whatever. He never answers it. I know the answer to it. The problem is the reason that Joe doesn't know the answer to how they transported the blocks up the Niles because nobody's told him. It's actually not a mystery, and this is one of those things where I hoped the actual Egyptologist who knows this answer would actually tell him the answer. But for one reason or another, he just goes nuts and doesn't tell Joe the answer. So when Joe talks about this with other personalities that are in the alternative field, and they talk about how did they get these giant granite blocks from Aswan to Giza, how is that even possible? What, they couldn't use the boats. I remember one time he had Jimmy Corsetti and Uncharted X on, and I love them both, but they actually said there's no way they could have done that. I mean, we have Khufu's boat that they found next to the pyramid, and there's no way you're transporting blocks on that. Well, that's true. That's Khufu's boat. It's not a cargo ship. That's like saying there's no way the Saudis could transport millions of barrels of oil a day across the sea. I mean, look at the king's yacht. Two different things. The true answer is they used reed barges. A lot of boats in Egypt were made out of reeds because wood was pretty precious. They had wooden boats, but a lot of times they made reed boats. And basically they just took the reeds, bundled up, wrapped them together, shaped them into a boat. And this still goes on today. It turns out reeds, they're plentiful, they're cheap, they grow fast, easy to work with, and the tubes are hollow, they're filled with air, so that you can be buoyant for a lot of weight. You can look at Brian Forrester's work over in Peru, where he basically goes out and shows the people that live on man-made islands in Lake Titicaca that are made out of reeds, and they build these huge reed barges. But they also did in Egypt. It's documented. And for some reason, for the life of me, I cannot find a picture online, even though I've seen it on a documentary and I've seen it in a book. But at the sandstone quarry in Upper Egypt, all right, on the Nile, there's a big carving that they did, and it was the transporting of Hatshepsut's obelisks, and those are giant pieces of granite that put anything in the Great Pyramid to shame, and they're sitting on giant reed barges. Okay, it's documented. They used reed boats. Okay, that's basically, I don't know how they got it on the damn boat, but once they did, because the Nile current flows from south to north, literally they just put the barge into the middle of the river, and the current is even stronger during inundation, and all they have to do is steer it, and it goes all the way up, and they just pull in, and then how they get it off the damn boat's another story. I don't know. But if anybody could tell Joe Rogan that, it's reed boats. You can go ahead and research it. Reed barges. Still use them today. That's what they did. It's documented. So it's not a mystery. Okay. So they go through all that. And then a really good part that Dr. Hawass did a fairly good job was explaining the Merer Papyrus, which I did a video on, and how that is a written documentation of the building of the pyramid from a person who actually worked in its construction. He went over what's in it. A lot of the stuff that is backed up, mentioned in that papyrus, that's backed up by hard archaeology. Good job. Then he says something about, Is there any other questions? So Joe asks a couple questions. The first one is, he says, how do you feel about the Giza Plateau being the original site of Zeptey, a revered site? On the side, I've also covered this. I am a believer that the site was holy before. There was something there. And Dr. Hawass even mentioned in the construction of the pyramids that the bottom 20 feet are carved from the bedrock. So the pyramids are leveraged on something that was already there. Okay? So the site has to be older, in my opinion. I'm not the only one that thinks that, but I'm on board with that. So he says, how do you feel about it being Zeptey? To which Dr. Hawass goes, what's that? I've never heard of that. I don't know what that is. And he just goes off on this big thing. Let me explain. So Joe reads the AI Zeptey and then how it ties to the Egyptian creation myth. Dr. Hawass says, I'd never heard that. That's false. He just goes off on this tirade. And he asks Jamie and them, he says, see if you can find out who originally published that, because I've never heard of it. And even Jamie can't figure it out. So I will clear this up. When I first, like I said, I've been reading about ancient Egypt since I was a child, over 40 years. I didn't hear the term Zeptey until I watched Ancient Aliens. So, and I have encyclopedias on Egyptian mythology written by Egyptologists. Not only do they explain everything to you, they tell you exactly where they got it from, and they give you the hieroglyphs that they translated it from and the translations. So anybody who's fluent in hieroglyphs can look and see if their interpretation jives, or they can go look at the actual temple wall, tomb wall, papyrus, or wherever this is all being translated from. And there's several creation myths, several versions. And I will tell you, in any of these books, the term Zeptey does not occur. The reason is, there's a gentle way to explain this. Alternative researchers tend to invest a lot into mythology as part of their theories and their ideas to prove their ideas. They will use mythology, in the case of the Egyptians, that is about the Egyptians, but actually wasn't invented by the Egyptians. Okay? For example, the Emerald Tablets of Thoth. If you go back in time to any period in ancient Egyptian history and ask anybody about these Emerald Tablets, they'll have no clue what you're talking about. Because the Emerald Tablets is actually a Greek myth about the Egyptian gods, but it's somehow attributed to the Egyptians. Okay, it's in the same way this Zeptey term for the original mound of creation is not the Egyptian term. So if you went back and asked an ancient Egyptian about Zeptey, then what the hell are you talking about? That's why he says that. He says he doesn't concern himself with outside stuff. He only knows what is in Egypt. So that's the reason he says that. So Zeptey is not an Egyptian term for the mound of creation. It's another myth about Egypt that the Egyptians didn't create, but it's attributed to them. I hope everybody gets that. All right? That's why he did. That's why he went nuts. What that also proves about Dr. Hawass is he doesn't read anybody else's stuff. So if it's not an accredited Egyptologist, somebody from it doesn't matter. He's never read Graham Hancock stuff. He's never read John Anthony's. He's debated both of them, but he's never read their stuff. He's never read it. Okay, so why he would render an opinion on any when he doesn't know what they're talking about. Okay? The next thing Joe asks about is the King's List, and he says, what about this King's List that shows kings going back 30,000 years? Let's stop there. This is, every time he says this, I yell at my screen, you're confused, Joe. This isn't the Egyptian King's List he's referring to. He's referring to the Sumerian kings list, which lists kings going back thousands and thousands of years and also ruling for an inordinate amounts of time. The Egyptians kings list do not. You have two primary ones, the one at Abydos and the Turin kings list. Now, where people kind of speculate is on the Turin kings list, it's a copy of an Old Kingdom kings list, and there's a piece missing. And in this piece, it starts listing pre-dynastic pharaohs, okay? And they said there's enough room for 1,000 years worth of pharaohs, okay? But if you're into ancient Egyptian history seriously at all, you'll know that the dynastic period that we're all familiar with, that we're all talking about, starting with the first pharaoh, is actually the culmination of the consolidation of Egypt previous to that. So previous to the first pharaoh Menes, after Narmer unified, there were two Egypts. So at that time there were two kings. And then before that, they were consolidated into those two kingdoms from the smaller kingdoms. So before that, there were several kings. So the kings list could be bigger in pre-dynastic history, but there are multiple kings ruling at the same time. Okay? Still not 30,000 years worth. That's why Hawass is like, I don't know what you're talking about. Because if somebody could please let Joe Rogan know, it's not the Egyptian kings list. It's the Sumerian kings list with the Anunnaki. That's what Joe's thinking about, not the Egyptian one. Okay, so now we're going to go to the Sphinx. That's the next thing he wants to cover. And this is where we're going to have some fun. So, he talks about the Sphinx and how it's Khafre, and when they built it, and Edgar Casey's son came, talked to him, and he decided to explore around the Sphinx to see if there was a chamber under the pause, but all he found were these looter tunnels, okay? And then you get into another one of those questions that he doesn't understand, where Joe's talking about there's a door on top of the head, and he says, there's no door. No, there's a door covering the tunnel. No, there's no door. And then they show the top with the damn cover, and he says, no, that's just a cover. It's not a door. That's how he thinks. So, like I said, it's a chore to talk to him. It really is. So he says there's no chambers. He's looked all around that. Great. So Joe brings up Dr. Shock and the water erosion as far as the age of the Sphinx. Well, he goes into this deal. He literally does one of the things Egyptologists do that's one of my favorite things. I'll tell you what it is. It's funny. He talks about that the bottom part of the Sphinx is shitty limestone, and it gets better as it goes up, these 3 levels, and that's why the head looks great in the body and the enclosure looks like trash, okay? And that after Dr. Shock's report, he called in some renowned geologist from the United States, came out, did analysis, said this is absolutely wind erosion, okay? Man. He proceeds, this is my favorite part, he proceeds to tell Joe the stories of how the damn thing has been completely buried for much of its history. And Egyptologists do this and can't make the connection in their head that when it's buried for long periods of time, there's no wind getting in there. So he talks about the Tuthmosis and the Dream Stela, where he uncovered it in antiquity. Then he tops it off with Herodotus never wrote about the Sphinx because it was completely buried when he was there. That's also in antiquity. And we know for a fact, for at least 2,000 years since the fall of Egypt, it was completely buried up until the turn of the 20th century, when it was completely uncovered for the first time in a long time. During the entire period of the Muslims and everybody coming in, Napoleon, even Napoleon, the pictures, it's buried up to its neck. Okay? He does that. Can't make that connection. So if I can safely say that thing has been completely buried for 2,500 years of the last 4,500 years, then how does he factor that in that that's 4,000 years worth of wind erosion? It doesn't make any sense. And it just blows my mind. I'm on board with the Sphinx is older. You want to know who built it? Egyptians. Okay? A long time. Egyptians have been in the Nile Valley for thousands of years. So I have no problem with that being 10,000 years old. It was probably something else and they restored it. That's me, but Hawass just goes off on this tangent, doesn't make the connection in his head ever. None of them ever do. That the thing is documented to have been buried for a great portion of the last 4,500 years. There's no wind eroding a completely buried statue, folks. Okay. Then he tries to get Joe to come introduce him at his lecture, and no more real information. So it was a shorter watch. It didn't do anything. If anything else, it makes everybody think that he's hiding stuff, and he isn't. The story about the guy wanting to see his bathroom was pretty funny. I know Hawass he is an expert, guys. He is the ring you've got to kiss if you want to do anything in Egypt. But it's really hard to talk to him. It's really hard to read his book, too. Now, some of you may ask, because Joe did ask about the SART scan for the Khafre Pyramid. I don't want to cover it too much because I don't want to talk about it until I get some scientific data out of the peer reviews. And they go into this, but I will go into this. He talks to Dr. Hawass about the Osiris Shaft, and they picked it up on the scan. Now, Hawass gave him the answer to why that happened, but he flat out said, I don't know anything about how these scans work. I have to use the experts that I have, such as the Scan Pyramids team I'm working with. They're using all the latest stuff. They know what this scan is, and they said it can't do that. But I made a video about that. I don't want to talk about that part here. But as far as the Osiris Shaft, that he could have explained to Joe, and he did. He's on this thing of that Joe said they discovered it. No, I discovered, and he got all ticked off, and that's the way he is. But so I'll clear this up. Remember how Dr. Hawass said it's open. The Osiris Shaft is open to the sky. You can see down it from the plateau. The reason why the radar scan would see it is because it's open to the sky. There is no obstruction. There's no bedrock. It can see straight down the shaft and bounce around and see everything all the way to the bottom. That's why they were able to see it. It wasn't an isolated underground structure with no openings. And for me, that's why they were able to see the Osiris Shaft so well. It's not an accurate test for what it can see when there's nothing showing. Okay. But for that, let's wait for the scientists to hash that one out. And hey, I hope there's something under the Khafre Pyramid, but right now I'm not buying the scan. But I'm going to wait for everybody else to come out. Other than that, that's it. If you want to drop me some hate in the comments, that's great. I'd love a subscription. And, if you can find somewhere documented in ancient Egyptian texts, the term Zeptey, let me know, because I've never seen it either. It's only been in later stuff that wasn't even attributed to the Egyptians. So anyway, thanks for stopping by. I'll talk to everybody later. Bye.